I hope you notice that there is a theme to our songs this morning. They're all about Jesus and about the good news, the gospel of Jesus coming into this world. As I said, we're not going to have a sermon this morning. I'm going to tell you my story, which happened something around 43 years ago tonight, or give or take a few days. I was 16, I'd left school. I got my first job in engineering, a company called Ambrose Shardlaws over at Blackburn at Rotherham. And I've been working there 2 or 3 weeks, and my cousin said, why don't you come to our church? My cousin became a Christian a few years before in a Pentecostal church at the end of the road where I lived. And he said, why don't you come? I wasn't really very bothered. But I was a young 16-year-old, rather naive in many ways, and certainly not worldly wise. And he said, I bought a brand new car, an Opel Manta Berlinetta, MRA 489P. It was orange with a black vinyl roof and black velour seats. I can't remember much about it, as you can see. And so he took me his new car as a 16-year-old. I was mesmerised. I went to the church. They made me feel welcome. It was a 6:30 gospel service. It was lively. It was noisy. People were there. And the service people made me welcome. People talked to me. I'd not had a girlfriend at 16, and the girls came talking to me, and I was sort of slightly embarrassed by it. And they had a very strong youth group of about 40, aged between about 14 to about 21. They went somewhere after the service, and I went with them. And my cousin said, do you want to come next week? I said, yeah, fine. And I went the second week, and it was very similar. The format of the service was exactly the same every week. You went in there, they sang choruses for 20 minutes. Then an old man, seemed a very old man. Unfortunately, I'm probably about 12 years away from his age now, so not as old as I thought. He welcomed everyone, spoke. He introduced a singing group, and there were ladies, some of them, and they had to wear hats. Or it was an individual guitarist, and he sang. Then there was a reading, some prayers, and he gave a sermon of about 20 minutes. It was a similar sermon every week, I learned, in the succeeding years. And I sat there through it. Exactly the same happened. People made me welcome, had a cup of tea after service, went to someone's house afterwards, went home. My cousin said, do you want to come again next week? I said, well, I'm not really very bothered. He said, just come one more time. Just come one more time. I said, well, all right. So I'll bring my new car again. I thought, all right, yes. And so I went on that final Sunday. I wasn't going again. That was my last night. And it was the same as you went in. You went in, they welcomed you, we sat down, we sang about 4 or 5 choruses. They had a singing group, they had a reading, a prayer. The man gave a sermon. And it was always a similar ending. It's the 3rd week I've been there. At the end of the sermon, he gave an appeal. He said something like, if tonight you recognise that you are a sinner, you recognise that you are missing something with God being in your life, you want to get right with God, and you want to invite Jesus Christ into your life, we're going to bow our heads, and I want you to put your hand up. I'd been there for the 2 previous weeks, so I knew exactly what happened. And so we bowed our heads, and I knew that every time that old man at the front, Mr. Harry Webb, they called him, every time Mr. Webb said, Amen, that meant someone had put their hand up. I knew that from 2 previous weeks, and so I bowed my head. And as I bowed my head, they got small little carpet squares on the floor, and I was thinking, I'll count these carpet squares. It'll soon be over, we'll have the cup of tea, go back to someone's house, I'll go home, and I'll get back into my normal life, which I thought was quite exciting, because that week, me and a friend of mine from work had managed to get into an X film, actually Confessions of a Window Cleaner, hardly the most raunchy film you might ever see, that week. And so it was like a carry-on film, really. Anyway, I bowed my head, looked at the floor, started to count these carpet tiles, and suddenly, as I bent over, it felt as if someone had put a 56-pound sack of potatoes on my shoulders, and I felt weighed down. My heart started to beat. I started to sort of slightly hyperventilate. I started to sweat, that cold sweat that I get when I go into the dentist. When I go into the dentist and I smell that smell, and I can hear the drilling, that buzz of the drill, my heart starts to race, and I felt my heart racing. I started to hyperventilate. I thought, what is going on here? I felt this weight on my shoulders. And this voice came into my head. It said this is it, John. You've got to give your life to me. And I remember thinking, give my life to what? At the same time, this other voice came into my head, saying, don't do it. If you put your hand up, they will laugh at you. It was as if it was one of those films and time stood still and everyone else was just stationary, and there was just me in this space. I felt I got this weight on my shoulders. I was sweating, my heart was beating, and these voices, conflicting voices, one saying, "This is it, John. You've got to give your life to me." And the other saying, "Don't, you fool. If you put your hand up, they will laugh at you." After what seemed like, well, a long time, it can not have been more than 20 seconds. And I heard the old man say, "Amen." I thought, that's it. Someone's put the hand up, I won't be the first. After those 20 seconds, I raised my hand and I heard them at the front say, "Amen. There's the first." So I felt it convey to some degree, really, but anyway, by the by. As I put my hand up, this weight lifted from my shoulders. My heartbeat immediately went back to normal. I stopped sweating. Something had changed. Two other people put their hands up that night, and there were two other amens at the end of the service. The old man said, "Those who put their hands up tonight, would you come to the front at the end of the service?" And so at the end of the service, my cousin who sat next to me, I didn't know, but he and his friends had been praying for me for the last few weeks, as I prayed for people in the future and continue to do so. I went to the front and I was led into the vestry. The three of us were led into three separate rooms by three separate individuals. And a man I later got to know, and whose son was best man at my wedding, and I was best man at his wedding, a man who was still alive now, and a couple whose house I spent many hours at, who really encouraged me in my faith. This man said to me, "You're Jack's cousin, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know what you've done tonight?" I said, "I've no idea." He said, "You've given your life to Jesus." And I said, "Oh, have I?" I can't believe it now, but that was the beginning of my Christian life. That night, something changed, something in here. Jesus Christ entered into my life. Not religion, not churchianity, as I've said before in many ways, are dull as dishwater, or can be dull as dishwater. Church to me only has context in the fact that we are seeking to extol and talk about the light and life and love that Jesus wants to bring to us. I went home that night differently. I walked on air. It was as if there was a soft sponge of air underneath my feet. I was different. I went to work. I was an apprentice in an engineering firm, and, telling them I'd become a Christian, well, they took the mickey out of me. Actually, it put backbone into my faith. You either stood or fall, and thankfully I stood. I became part of that church until eventually, after probably about 18 months, I was going 4 times a week. A prayer meeting, a Bible study, twice on a Sunday. That youth group, they became my friends, almost like family. That is my story of faith. And I'm here 43 years later. When I look back and when I think about the doubts I've had in my life, I look back at that night because I cannot deny that experience. When the Apostle Paul talks of his faith, he cannot deny his experience on the Damascus Road. Oh, people have tried to talk about it. Or maybe he had an epileptic fit. Maybe he had this, maybe he had that, maybe. But someone once said, a person with an experience is never at the mercy of a person with an argument. These arguments are all well and good. My experience and subsequent experiences over the last 43 years mean that I am a believer, a follower of Jesus Christ. Each of us as Christians have stories. We need to become confident in telling others our stories of faith, that they might come to encounter the living Christ for themselves. Our next song is "I Stand Amazed in the Presence of Jesus the Nazarene."